For thousands of years, people have argued about where the Indians really came from. Some stories describe India as the homeland of a single ancient population that remained almost unchanged. Others imagine repeated invasions, replacing one population after another. And for generations, archaeology, linguistics, history, and genetics appeared to tell slightly different versions of the past. Now the picture is becoming much clearer. Scientists have analyzed thousands of Indian genomes and ancient DNA from South Asia and surrounding regions, and the result is not a single origin story. It is something far more fascinating. Most people living in India today descend from several ancient populations that met, mixed, separated, and formed new communities over tens of thousands of years. The deepest layer comes from the first modern humans who reached South Asia after leaving Africa, probably around 50,000 years ago. Later came ancestry related to ancient Iranian and Central Asian populations, followed much later by ancestry associated with Eurasian steppe pastoralists. These groups did not simply replace one another. They mixed in different proportions, creating the extraordinary genetic diversity found across the subcontinent today. And recent research is adding another layer. Scientists are discovering that India's genetic history varies enormously from one region, language community, and social group to another. So the real mystery is not whether Indians came from one place. The evidence increasingly suggests that modern Indians are descendants of multiple ancient populations whose histories became intertwined inside one of the world's most complex demographic landscapes. To understand this story, we have to go far beyond the history of kingdoms, religions, and written civilizations. The genetic history of South Asia begins before the Indus Valley civilization, before agriculture became widespread, and before the languages spoken in modern India existed in their current forms. The earliest major ancestry layer visible in modern South Asians comes from populations descended from the first modern humans, who expanded out of Africa and moved through southern Asia. Genetic studies suggest that a major migration into South Asia occurred roughly 50,000 years ago. These early populations eventually became deeply differentiated from groups living elsewhere, and their descendants contributed ancestry to many later South Asian communities. They were not Indian in the modern cultural sense. There was no India as a country, no Sanskrit, no Dravidian language family as we know it today, and no caste system. They were hunter-gathering populations, adapting to a huge region stretching from the Arabian Sea through the subcontinent and towards Southeast Asia. Some of their genetic descendants later became part of what researchers call the ancient ancestral South Indian, or AASI, component. AASI is not the name of a known ancient civilization or a single tribe. It is a scientific model representing ancestry related to deeply ancient South Asian populations, for which we currently have little or no direct ancient DNA. Researchers infer this ancestry partly through comparisons with present-day groups in ancient genomes. One important result of modern genomic research is therefore that a major component of Indian ancestry is not simply European, Iranian, or Central Asian. It represents an ancient South Asian population that was already present long before later migrations transformed the region. But here is where the story becomes much more complicated. The ancestors of modern Indians were not one isolated population living unchanged for 50,000 years. South Asia was repeatedly connected to surrounding regions by migration, trade, climate corridors, and changing environments. One of the most important later ancestry components came from populations related to ancient Iranian hunter-gatherers and early farming communities. For a long time, scientists debated whether Iranian-related ancestry in South Asia came directly from early farmers moving east from the Iranian-plateau. Ancient DNA has provided a much more nuanced answer. The genetic relationship between South Asians and ancient Iranian populations appears to derive from a lineage that separated from Iranian-plateau populations before the emergence of fully developed agriculture. Ancient individuals associated with the Indus Valley civilization carried a combination of ancestry related to ancient Iranian populations and deeply indigenous South Asian ancestry. This was a critical discovery because it showed that the genetic connection between the Indus region and ancient Iran did not necessarily represent a simple mass migration of Iranian farmers into India. Instead, related populations may have shared much older ancestry and developed agriculture or settled lifestyles in different regions. The Indus Valley population therefore became one of the major ancestral sources for later South Asians, but it was itself already a mixture of older populations. That means the genetic story of India was complicated before the arrival of the steppe ancestry that has become one of the most debated parts of South Asian history. The people of the Indus Valley civilization are especially important because their civilization emerged more than 4,000 years ago across a huge area of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-daro developed sophisticated urban systems, water management, craft production, long-distance exchange, and standardized material culture. Yet for decades, scientists had almost no ancient DNA from the civilization. because DNA preservation in the hot South Asian environment is extremely difficult. One of the breakthrough discoveries was the genome of an individual associated with the Indus Valley civilization, whose genetic profile showed a mixture of ancestry related to ancient Iranian populations and ancestry related to ancient South Asian hunter-gatherers. Importantly, the individual lacked the steppe ancestry that became significant in many later South Asian populations. This meant that the genetic structure associated with the Indus civilization existed before the arrival of substantial steppe-related ancestry into South Asia. The finding did not answer every question about the people of the Indus civilization, but it provided a crucial genetic anchor. It demonstrated that one of the major ancestral components of later South Asians was already present in the subcontinent before the Bronze Age movements from the Eurasian steppe. The Indus population therefore became a bridge between the deepest indigenous ancestry of South Asia and the later populations that would shape the genetic landscape of northern and southern India. Then came another major movement, and this one changed South Asia dramatically. During the Bronze Age and later periods, populations associated with the Eurasian steppe expanded eastward and southward. Ancient DNA from Central Asia and South Asia has shown that steppe-related ancestry eventually entered the Indian subcontinent after roughly the 2nd millennium BCE. This ancestry is closely related to populations associated with Bronze Age steppe societies, which also contributed ancestry to many European populations. The appearance of steppe-related ancestry in South Asia is especially interesting because it correlates broadly with the spread of Indo-Iranian languages, although genetics alone cannot prove exactly which languages specific individuals spoke. The ancestry did not arrive as one giant army that replaced the existing population. Instead, it appears to have entered through migration and admixture, becoming particularly noticeable in northern and northwestern populations, and especially in groups historically associated with Indo-European languages and certain social strata. The steppe contribution then interacted with existing Indus-related and indigenous South Asian ancestry. This produced one of the two major ancestry poles that later became visible in modern Indian populations. The other major pole was the ancestry associated with ancient South Asian hunter-gatherers and populations carrying more AASI-related ancestry. Over time, mixtures between these components created the genetic cline that characterizes much of India today. This is one of the strongest reasons scientists reject the idea that modern Indians descend from only one ancient group. The genetic data show multiple sources, and those sources arrived at different times. This is where the terms ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian become important, but also dangerous if misunderstood. Researchers use ANI and ASI as genetic modeling concepts rather than literal ancient tribes. They do not mean that there were two ancient populations called North Indians and South Indians who lived exactly as modern categories suggest. Instead, ANI represents ancestry related to a mixture containing ancient Iranian-related and steppe-related components, while ASI represents ancestry formed largely through the mixture of Indus-related ancestry with deeply indigenous South Asian ancestry. Both were themselves mixtures. Neither was genetically pure. Over the course of thousands of years, these ancestral streams mixed in varying proportions across the subcontinent. Some modern populations lie closer to the ASI side of the genetic spectrum. Others lie closer to the ANI side. Many are somewhere in between. That is why there is no single Indian DNA. The Indian subcontinent contains a continuous range of ancestry proportions shaped by geography and historical population movement. Modern caste and tribal groups can have very different genetic profiles despite living relatively close to one another. In some areas, neighboring communities have maintained strong genetic boundaries for centuries. In others, populations mix more extensively. The result is one of the most genetically complex regions on Earth. The newest large-scale studies are making this complexity even clearer. Researchers recently analyzed whole genomes from 2,562 individuals, representing most geographic regions of India, major language families, and many tribal and caste populations. The study described this as a major expansion of Indian genomic data, because India had previously been underrepresented in global sequencing projects. The researchers found that most Indians derive ancestry from three major sources: South Asian hunter-gatherer-related ancestry, ancestry related to ancient Iranian and Central Asian farmers or hunter-gatherers, and Eurasian steppe pastoralist ancestry. But the proportions differ substantially across populations. The study also found that India underwent a major demographic shift toward endogamy after the major admixture events. Endogamy means people increasingly marry within their own communities. Over many generations, this created strong genetic signatures, including long-shared DNA segments and elevated levels of homozygosity within certain groups. This means modern Indian population structure is not simply the result of ancient migrations. It is also the result of thousands of years of social organization. Ancient people mixed, and later their descendants increasingly separated into communities that married internally. Modern DNA therefore preserves both processes. The admixture created the major ancestral components. Endogamy then preserved and amplified genetic differences among many communities. This is one reason India has so many genetically distinct populations. The subcontinent is not simply divided into north and south. It contains hundreds of communities with their own histories, languages, marriage networks, migration patterns, and demographic events. Two groups living in neighboring districts can sometimes be genetically more different from each other than distant populations might expect. This does not mean they are separate races. It reflects strong endogamy in population structure. Over generations, when people predominantly marry within a community, genetic differences accumulate. Rare variants can become more common. Long stretches of shared DNA can remain intact. Genetic diseases can become more prevalent within particular groups. At the same time, many of these communities continue to share the broader ancestral components found throughout the Indian population. This combination of shared deep ancestry and recent genetic separation is one of the defining features of South Asian population genetics. It explains why the genetic history of India is so difficult to summarize in one sentence. The ancestors of modern Indians mixed extensively in the past, but many of their descendants became increasingly isolated afterward. The resulting structure is like a mosaic, pieces from several ancient populations, arranged into hundreds of later communities. That is why scientists need thousands of genomes rather than a few famous samples to understand Indian ancestry accurately. The story becomes even more fascinating when scientists examine the Austroasiatic and Dravidian-speaking tribal populations. A major 2026 study using whole genome data from the Genome Asia project found that ancestral components associated with tribal Dravidian and Austroasiatic populations diverged around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, shortly after the last glacial maximum. The research also found that Indian and Southeast Asian Austroasiatic ancestries separated earlier, around 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, suggesting that related ancestral populations were distributed across South and Southeast Asia before agriculture became widespread. This is significant because it shows that the genetic landscape of South Asia cannot be explained entirely by Bronze Age migrations. Some of its deepest structure goes back tens of thousands of years. The study also found more recent gene flow between Central Indian Dravidian and Austroasiatic tribes, demonstrating that language and genetics do not always move together. A population can adopt or shift languages without completely replacing its ancestry. Likewise, neighboring groups can exchange genes while retaining different cultural identities. This genetic linguistic mismatch is an important lesson for India. Language is not a perfect map of ancestry. A Dravidian-speaking population can carry ancestry connected to multiple ancient groups. An Austroasiatic-speaking group can contain substantial South Asian ancestry. Culture and biology interact, but they are not identical systems. And then there is the Himalayan region, where new ancient DNA is revealing connections that were previously almost invisible. A 2026 study analyzed 10 ancient genomes from Old Lady Spider Cave in Ladakh, dating to roughly 1,500 years ago. These remains came from an environment more than 4,000 meters above sea level, where people lived in a region connecting South Asia and the Tibetan Plateau. The researchers found evidence of admixture between Tibetan-related and South Asian ancestry around 2,800 years ago. This is important because it shows that population movement across the Himalayas was occurring far earlier and in more complex ways than simplistic historical maps suggest. The mountains were not an absolute barrier. People crossed them, traded, moved, and formed communities adapted to high-altitude environments. Ancient genomes can therefore reveal connections that written records do not fully preserve. The Ladakh evidence adds another piece to the puzzle by showing that South Asian genetic history included interaction with populations from the Tibetan world. India was never genetically isolated behind mountains. The subcontinent was a crossroads. People moved through deserts, mountain passes, forests, coastlines, and river valleys. Every region contributed another layer to the final genetic landscape. The southern part of the subcontinent tells an equally fascinating story. Modern South Indian populations often contain high levels of ancestry associated with the ancient ASI-related component, but that does not mean Southern Indians represent an untouched ancient population. They also carry ancestry connected to Iranian-related groups and other historical populations. A 2025 study of Sri Lankan populations found that Adivasi and Sinhalese groups share significant genetic relationships with present-day South Indian Dravidian-speaking populations, suggesting long-term connections between South India and Sri Lanka. This matters because the sea between India and Sri Lanka was never a complete genetic wall. Populations moved across the region over thousands of years. Genetic similarities between southern Indian and Sri Lankan communities may preserve ancient movements that are difficult to reconstruct from written history alone. The same pattern appears across the Bay of Bengal. where South Asia and Southeast Asia were connected through migration and trade long before modern borders existed. Modern Indian ancestry is therefore partly continental and partly maritime. The coast mattered, islands mattered, river systems mattered, mountain passes mattered, geography shaped migration, but it never completely prevented movement. One of the most important discoveries in Indian genetics is that Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry is also present. Modern Indians derive roughly 1 to 2% of their ancestry from archaic hominins, primarily Neanderthals and Denisovans. Large-scale sequencing has shown that Indians possess substantial variation in Neanderthal ancestry, including many population-specific segments. This is another reminder that the first humans who entered South Asia did not simply move into an empty landscape. They inherited genes from encounters with other human populations. Some archaic ancestry may have entered the ancestors of modern South Asians during the migration out of Africa and subsequent movement through Eurasia. Researchers have now reconstructed a large fraction of the Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes from fragments carried by modern Indians. This is extraordinary because the original archaic populations are mostly gone. Their genetic inheritance survives inside modern humans. The Indian subcontinent, therefore, contains not only layers of modern human ancestry, but also echoes of extinct human relatives. Yet again, this does not mean Indians are genetically closer to Neanderthals than other populations in any simplistic sense. It means their populations preserve a rich collection of archaic segments inherited through ancient migration routes. The role of steppe ancestry is one of the most debated parts of Indian genetic history, especially because it intersects with questions about language and ancient social identity. Genetic evidence shows that steppe-related ancestry entered South Asia after the decline of the Indus Valley civilization and became more common in many northern populations and among groups associated with Indo-European languages. Ancient DNA from Central Asian and steppe populations provides a genetic link to the same broad ancestry that expanded across parts of Europe during the Bronze Age. But genetics does not prove that steppe migrants directly introduced Sanskrit, nor does it prove that one modern caste group represents one ancient population. Cultural change and genetic change do not always happen together. Languages can spread through small elite groups without massive population replacement. Conversely, large migrations can occur without completely replacing local languages. The strongest interpretation is that steppe-related populations contributed ancestry to South Asia, and that this movement occurred during a period when Indo-Iranian languages were spreading across parts of the region. The genetic evidence is therefore one component of a larger archaeological and linguistic story, not a complete explanation by itself. Science becomes stronger when genetics, archaeology, and linguistics are considered together. This also changes the debate over whether modern Indians came mainly from outside or mainly from within the subcontinent. The evidence says neither extreme is correct. A large portion of Indian ancestry comes from populations that were already deeply established in South Asia before the Bronze Age. Another substantial portion comes from populations related to ancient Iranian and Central Asian groups. Still later, steppe-related ancestry entered many populations. Additional ancestry came through East Asia, Southeast Asia, Tibet, and other regions at different times. The result is therefore neither complete continuity nor complete replacement. India experienced continuity through deep indigenous ancestry, but it also experienced repeated migration and admixture. This is exactly what we would expect from a region that has been occupied by modern humans for roughly 50,000 years and has served as a crossroads between several parts of Eurasia. The word origin is therefore misleading if it suggests one moment when Indians appeared. Modern Indians emerged through a long process. Their ancestors were already in South Asia when later populations arrived. Those populations mixed. Then their descendants became separated into many communities. Every modern group inherited a different combination of that history. The latest Genome India research makes this even more important. In 2026, Nature India reported that the Genome India project had analyzed whole genomes from 9,168 healthy people, representing 83 populations. The study identified nearly 130 million genetic variants and around 44 million variants that were absent from major global genetic databases. This is a staggering result because it shows how much genetic diversity in India was missing from the world's genomic reference resources. Researchers expected new variants, but the scale of the discovery was much larger than anticipated. This means India is not just genetically diverse because of its ancient ancestry. It is also diverse at the level of rare and population-specific variants that can affect medicine. Some of these variants may influence disease susceptibility or drug response. Others may simply represent neutral genetic diversity. But the fundamental point is clear. Indian populations have been severely underrepresented in global genomic studies, and large-scale sequencing is revealing biological information that researchers could not see before. The genetic map of India is therefore still being built. What scientists believed about Indian ancestry 20 years ago was based on far less data. Today's picture is much more detailed, and tomorrow's will likely be more complicated again. There is a powerful medical reason why these discoveries matter. India contains enormous genetic diversity, but many Indian communities also have long histories of endogamy. This combination can produce distinctive population-specific variants. Some rare inherited disorders are much more common in particular communities because founder effects increase the frequency of certain mutations. At the same time, India's diverse ancestry can reveal protective variants that are rare elsewhere. The Genome India project is therefore not only reconstructing history, it is creating a reference resource for disease research. A population that was genetically invisible in international databases is becoming visible. This can improve diagnostics, identify genetic risk, and help researchers develop treatments that work more effectively for South Asian populations. The lesson goes far beyond India. Every major human population deserves representation in genomic research. A medical model trained mostly on European data cannot capture the full diversity of humanity. South Asian genomes are demonstrating this dramatically because researchers are finding tens of millions of variants that previously had no representation in global datasets. The future of precision medicine depends on including these populations, not treating them as an afterthought. What makes the Indian story especially fascinating is the way ancestry and social structure interact. Ancient populations mixed extensively, creating the major ancestral components found across South Asia. Later, communities became more endogamous. This reduced gene flow between many groups and allowed genetic differences to accumulate. In some cases, populations living relatively close together can show substantial genetic divergence because they have married internally for many generations. This is one reason caste and tribal communities can have distinctive genetic signatures, but genetics cannot be used to define a caste as an ancient biological race. Caste identities developed through social and historical processes, and genetic patterns reflect the marriage practices that followed, not a single ancient origin. A community can contain ancestry from several ancient sources, while maintaining a distinct genetic profile today because of endogamy. The DNA, therefore, records both ancient migration and recent social structure. That combination is one of the defining features of Indian genetic history, and this brings us to one of the biggest misconceptions. There is no single Indian gene. There is no pure Northern Indian genome and no pure Southern Indian genome. There is no tribe that represents the original Indians unchanged for 50,000 years. Modern Indians are mixtures. Their ancestry exists along gradients. Different groups carry different combinations of ancient South Asian, Iranian-related, Steppe-related, East Asian, and other components. Some populations also carry ancestry from more recent historical migrations. This is why scientists use statistical models rather than simple labels. A person's genome may be closer to one region at one part of the chromosome and another region elsewhere. Recombination has mixed the ancestral components over thousands of generations. What survives is a mosaic. Your genome is not one ancient population. It is the result of thousands of ancestors. So where did Indians really come from? The best scientific answer is that Indians came from multiple ancient populations that interacted over an extraordinarily long period. The first major modern human ancestry entered South Asia roughly 50,000 years ago after leaving Africa. Those populations became deeply established and contributed to the AASI-related ancestry found in many modern South Asians. Later, populations related to ancient Iranian and Central Asian peoples contributed additional ancestry. The Indus Valley civilization emerged from populations carrying a mixture of these ancestral components. After the decline of the Indus civilization, these populations mixed with groups carrying more indigenous South Asian ancestry, forming one major ancestry stream. Later, steppe-related groups entered South Asia and contributed another major component, particularly in northern regions. Additional migration from Tibet, Southeast Asia, and other neighboring areas added further layers. After these ancient admixture events, stronger endogamy created the detailed population structure visible today. This is not a story of one migration replacing another. It is a story of repeated mixture followed by separation. The story also explains why different Indians can look, speak, and live very differently while still sharing deep ancestry. India contains enormous geographic variation. Himalayan populations have histories connected to the Tibetan plateau. Northeast Indian groups can have significant East and Southeast Asian-related ancestry. Central Indian communities preserve distinct combinations of AASI-related, Austroasiatic, and other ancestries. Southern Indian groups often show higher AASI-related ancestry. Northern groups often carry greater proportions of steppe-related and Iranian-related components. But these are broad patterns, not rules for individuals. Modern India is full of exceptions because migration never follows perfect boundaries. Languages moved, people moved, communities adopted new identities. Endogamy later preserved some of these differences. The genetic landscape therefore resembles a detailed map with hundreds of overlapping regions, rather than a simple north-south division. And perhaps the most powerful part of the story is that ancient India was already diverse before the rise of the great civilizations that dominate history books. The genetic layers visible today began forming tens of thousands of years ago. The Indus cities were not the beginning of Indian ancestry. The Vedic period was not the beginning either. The great empires of Maurya, Gupta, Chola, Mughal, and others were extremely recent compared with the population history encoded in DNA. Human beings were living, migrating, mixing, and adapting across South Asia long before written records. Every later civilization inherited that demographic landscape. Political boundaries changed, languages changed, religions spread and transformed, the population moved, but the deep genetic layers remained. Modern genetics allows scientists to see below the surface of recorded history. The newest discoveries are making that map sharper. The 2026 Genome India dataset is uncovering millions of variants that were missing from global databases. The 2026 study of Austroasiatic and Dravidian-speaking tribes is revealing deep population splits dating to the period shortly after the last glacial maximum. The 2026 Ladakh genomes show ancient Tibetan South Asian admixture roughly 2,800 years ago. And the 2025 whole genome analysis of 2,962 Indians is integrating these findings into a broader model that combines South Asian hunter-gatherer, Iranian-related, and steppe-related ancestry. The picture is therefore becoming less about one origin and more about a sequence of population events. India did not have one beginning. It had many beginnings layered on top of one another. That may be the real answer to the title. Scientists did not discover one population that can be called the original Indians. They discovered something more surprising. Almost every modern Indian carries a genetic history built from multiple ancient populations. Some of those populations arrived tens of thousands of years ago. Others arrived much later, some mixed extensively. Others remained isolated. Some left descendants across the entire subcontinent. Others survived mainly through small communities. Some ancestry came from populations connected to the Iranian-plateau. Some came from Steppe pastoralists. Some came from deeply indigenous South Asian populations that have no single ancient fossil genome representing them. The final result is today's India, one of the most genetically diverse populations on Earth. And that means your DNA is not a straight line back to one ancient people. It is a story written by migrations, a story written by climate, a story written about agriculture, a story written by trade, a story written by war, a story written about marriage, a story written in isolation, and a story written by thousands of years of people meeting one another and becoming ancestors together. The biggest surprise is not that Indians came from somewhere else. It is that modern Indians came from many places and then became something new. The ancient DNA does not erase India's deep indigenous ancestry. It does not prove that later migrants replaced everyone. It does not support a single racial origin. It reveals a mixture, continuity, separation, and survival. The Indian subcontinent was never genetically empty, and it was never genetically isolated. Its people were there early. Its people mixed with newcomers. Its people moved into new regions. Its people adopted languages. Its communities became endogamous, and their DNA preserved the entire process. That is why scientists are still discovering new answers. The genome of India is too large, too diverse, and too complicated to fit into one ancient population. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. The question is no longer, which one population were the first Indians? The better question is, how did all these populations become the Indians who live here today? Modern genetics is finally allowing scientists to answer that question. And the answer is not written in one ancient skeleton, not in one kingdom, not in one language, not in one legend. It is written across millions of genomes. And the story those genomes tell is far more complicated than anyone expected.